All right, hello. My name's Kris. Thank you for coming to Cuz Books. And I just wanted to talk about 5 things I want to see more in publishing real quick. Not going to keep this one too long, just kind of get straight to the point. First off, what I want to see is more historical fantasy from people of color and LGBT. Some of my favorite books I've read recently, you have Library of Legends, you have Poppy War. They're books that have gone and had fantasy mixed with history. And yeah, I'm a history nerd, I like to learn. Also just as interesting in terms of context, to look at something differently, because we always get the exact same perspectives following the exact same characters, and it's so nice to see new things. Every time I read one of them, it felt fresh and new, and I felt just exhilarated and excited. It really helped get through the slump of last year, was finding things that were so new, so fresh, and that, yeah, sometimes you want comfort, but sometimes you want something completely new, something completely out of the box. All right, so last year was really hard getting through. It's still hard getting through everything these days, and just having something so new and fresh that gave me a whole new perspective, that gave me a whole new energy. It was great. And I want more from these writers. I want to see more things like them from all across. And what we really need is a lot more historical fantasy across the board from all groups. Fantasy from people of color, from LGBT communities has certainly gone up, and that's wonderful. It's a lot better than where it used to be, but I feel like historical fantasy is still lagging overall. I still feel like a lot of that is still focused more by white writers, and I'm really looking forward to it catching up so they can have that real diverse set of storytelling. So you can get whole new things and really see some innovations and new perspectives there. Branching off that a little bit is my second point, which is I in general want to see just more genre work from people of color and LGBT. And by that I mean the very detailed ones. The big one for me is I like espionage books, little spy novels, but they are hella white. They're old white men, and not just as writers, but as characters come across that way. And while certainly they're talented, though sometimes problematic, Ian Fleming is not someone I would recommend the creator of James Bond. His books are passively racist to actively racist. Sometimes he tries not to be racist, but it's very condescending. And he is violently homophobic almost. He described in Diamonds Are Forever, they have 2 gay assassins, and they are considered the most dangerous forms of assassins possible because they are psychopaths and evil and all these horrible things they say. It's awful. Like, it just is so offensive, and it's really irredeemable. And what I really want is just some fresh perspectives, help counteract that. Even the newer people who aren't necessarily just mud and filth in terms of the thought processes. And Ian Fleming was generally just a bad guy who slept with his friends' wives, was an alcoholic. Basically, a guy who thought he was Bond was really just horrible. But while you get away from that and we're having better work done overall, it's still very much the same perspective. And again, I want to see more variety. Recently, there have been more works getting into, and I want to see more of that. One of the few spy books that have been by different perspectives is Lauren Wilkinson's American Spy. She's a black writer, and she wrote about an actual person who existed, Thomas Sankara, in terms of historically. He was in Africa. He's considered Africa's Che Guevara. He was in Burkina Faso, and what she has is she introduces a black female spy in the 80s trying to get through the boys club and all the problems there, and she gets the job to basically take him down. So she has to work as a spy to befriend him, seduce him, have a coup to take him down, but the whole time dealing with his own charms, because the fact is he's supposed to be taken down because he's communist, or a little too communist for them, doesn't make him necessarily the worst person ever and deserve the fate. If he's helping the country, do you want to do this? And it gets to go into those things and the questionable aspects of just taking people down based on their ideologies, even if they are trying to do good. And so you get into some interesting things with that, and it was a cool book to come out. It was something that was different and felt fresh, and it didn't seem like it led to anything though, in terms of overall publishing. Like, this book came out, it sold well, it was on Barack Obama's 2019 summer list, and it didn't feel like it broke through anything. And it's only been a couple years, maybe those books were just written. Everything's publishing is, you know, on a delay for a couple years, especially with COVID. But it felt like an exception, and that's proving a rule as opposed to something that got to truly break through and make a difference. And it stinks because you want more of that. You want more fresh things. And I hope that eventually we get to see that. I want to see it. Some genres are doing better. I want to see in other genres. Westerns are incredibly white male, so the chance to see some other perspectives there would be good. Mysteries are doing better, I would say, overall. Well, I would say they do certainly lean white. They are better in terms of gender, and they are, I'd say, doing a lot better in terms of race, how they're starting to break down. I feel like they are, as someone who works as a bookstore, a little ahead of the curve in that regard. Like, they're working towards it at a better speed than, as I said, spy books. Generally action books, thrillers overall, you can lump in there. Anything with guns, boom, booms. Gosh knows I love a few of those. I love James Rowland. I love Matthew Riley. They're just not a genre that has a lot of diversity in it, though. And that's something that can definitely happen. That still feels like it's definitely shoehorned in. That one, I mean, get into action like that, and you get Jack Carr in them, and you still, was it Jack Carr, Tom Clancy, Mark Graney, Clive Cussler, sea of white, and honestly still men for the most part, vast majority. So that's still definitely slow to catch up. There are a few things here and there popping up. I've seen books where it'll be like, it's a lesbian protagonist, but it's still a straight white guy writing it, and it'll be like, I'm glad there's diversity there, and I'm glad it's a book with an LGBT protagonist that isn't about being LGBT. I love it anytime you actually see people just existing that way, and that will be something we'll see more. I'll touch on a little bit more in certain aspects in the future, but overall it is still very much a boys club, and I look forward to seeing that break down and get some real interesting takes on things, because we have seen so much of this done at the same time, in the same ways. All right. What I want to see reverse is actually more men in is romance. There's not a lot of men in romance, and I don't know if that's just due to not as many male writers, and how much of that is publishing not wanting it. But there's very few. In fact, I've seen male writers write as a female alias. I couldn't find that, looking for it real quick, because I know there's a guy who literally writes under basically the name of his grandmother, and it's going to drive me up the wall. And if we see it, we're going to place it on the screen real quick, the name, I can find it, but it's pretty much on the idea that that is a genre that seems to be still for women by women, and the things guys are getting into, especially now that you had things like the Bromance Book Club, which was great, but it's still, even though more male involved, written by a woman. And I'm not attacking the idea of that by any means, because it's an amazing book series. Adams did a great job with it, but I don't understand why there aren't more male writers in that genre, and I don't know if it's that the men aren't comfortable with writing those books or what it is. I'll say as a guy, I read those books. I enjoy those books, and I hope to see a lot more men in there. That's the one genre where men aren't, and I'd be fine with them starting to get in there, because also that would help break some gender roles on, as a male reader, be like, yeah, guys, get involved in this, and it'd be great to see. And I'm hoping that's something that's being worked on. There does seem to be more interest in men, and more as far as romance readers. There's starting to become a thing where romance book clubs were starting to pop up because of the books, the idea of guys reading romance and stuff, and I hope that still does well. I hope we get that, and we get some more male writers there, not just for guy perspective, but just in general. I want to see a little bit more difference there, and I'm curious what would be brought in by bringing that. What would be differences in plot or story, just to keep things fresh, to keep things competitive, and just keep any different changes and innovations going. So I'm really excited for that. And yes, I know my hair is awful. I've had hair. This is the best I could do. You can't really see it, thankfully, because it's the screen, but yeah, it's bad. But anyways, one thing I want to see, fourth thing, this is going to make some people mad. I want less retellings as marketings, because it feels like everything that comes out, they try to then shoehorn into a retelling of another thing. And a lot of it is supposed to be that way, and that's one thing, but it feels like a lot of times they go out of their way to make it happen. And you see that a lot, I feel like, with romance, with comparing it to Jane Austen, trying to find a way to frame it as one of her books, a modern day telling. And it's like, doesn't need to do that. These books stand on their own. And I feel like anytime someone wants to do something, particularly with when it's someone from that's not white or straight, they feel the need to do that as a retelling even more so, as opposed to letting them just say, this is a story. Like, the stories don't stand on their own, and they have to then be morphed into some understandable existing thing, as opposed to just letting them be new and fresh and just let them exist. I've never been a big fan of the retelling genre. Again, retelling, because a lot of them are different and new, and some of them are great for that, but a lot of it feels like they're just shoehorning these books, and I feel like they probably even are pressuring the writers to make them this way, so they're easier to sell, and it kind of is killing some things that I want to see. And you don't have to call something a retelling, because one, we generally know what you're referring to. We can read the back of the book like, oh, it's kind of like this. But so you don't have to force it in and call it that. And you can let it be different instead of trying to guide it so it just feels like another book that's similar to Jane Austen or whoever it is. Jane Austen seems to be the big one, but we'll bounce around some of the others too. And honestly, I don't need a modern day any of them. I just want original stories. And just because something's plot is somewhat similar, because they don't like each other and they do like each other or anything like that, doesn't mean it needs to be a modern day anything. It just is. It is its own story. And we don't have to call it a retelling. We can just say, this thing exists, this is what's going to happen, and it's going to be awesome. And not force it to always be compared to some old thing. All right, my last thing is I'd love to see more trans characters in books, especially not trans we're going to talk about being trans books, where that's the sole purpose of the character. Because that's the big thing where it's like, this person is trans, and this is going to be 400 pages about them being trans. And you don't get a lot of, they're just trans. They're trans, but they're a PI. We're going to talk about that, is what I would rather see. I'd like to see more of them just people existing that way. And I know that's an issue overall in LGBT, but I feel like trans has it the worst right now, where it's just a lot of characters who exist purely for the point of being trans, and that's like their character in itself. And it's not like they're trans, but hey, they also have Super Nintendo parties and love country music. Be different. Give me some variety. Make these characters people who just happen to be trans. And it feels like such a rare thing. And I don't see why we can't just do that. And I'm not saying we don't talk about the issues facing trans people, particularly trans writers. But overall, other writers can just include the characters, and we can help normalize so it's not a huge deal if someone is trans. Because so much of real world is based on media. And the fact is, media treats things like trans as crazy exotic things when it's just people. Where I've just met people and they're people and that's it. And you meet people in the real world and everything's normal, but in books it's this giant opera of a thing, and everything has to be about that one feature of them when there's so much more to them. And it feels like the people exist purely as plot points and not as people the same anyone else does. Someone can't just be trans. They have to be trans with a capital T, and here's their coming out story, and here's the reasons they've been sad and miserable through their life because the world is harsh, and as opposed to letting them be happy and find love and acceptance and succeed at their career. Because until you start seeing those things reflected, it's going to be a lot harder to get it in the real world, because everyone takes their cues from what they see and hear. I mean, you get that even with how people, wherever they get their news, determines how they are politically. How people get their media in all other forms is deciding how they view things, whether or not something's normal or not, whether or not something is safe or any of those is based on whether or not they see these things normalized. And what I really want to see is more just representation there, where it doesn't have to be a huge thing by any means. Just they exist, they are trans, But there are all these other things, and it's just a passing comment, the passing detail of the character, but it's not the point of the character. It can be that they are a magical sorcerer, they can be a detective, they can be whatever else, they can be a soldier. And the fact of the matter is, they don't have to be just that one thing of trans, but trans is just a small thing and a huge aspect of them. If it was one of those little word clouds and the biggest words are most important, it doesn't have to be the entire cloud. It can just be a thing, but we're focusing on all the rest of them. And yes, I'm sure everyone's complained about that 1,000 times, I know. I don't think I said anything that new other than asking for men in romance maybe, because I don't think many people care about that aspect. But thanks for stopping by, thanks for listening. Any disagreements, feel free to comment below, and have a good day.